Well, hey there, welcome back to our study in Acts. We are currently in this long narrative that started in chapter 21 and will continue all the way through the end of Acts, which is chapter 28. And so in these chapters, we find that Paul, he goes to Jerusalem, he's arrested, he's put through a number of different trials, and then he is sent to Rome. And so in this study, we're going to continue to look at that narrative, and we'll be in Acts chapters 25 and 26. Well, at the end of chapter 24, we find that Felix, the governor of this region, kept Paul in prison for 2 years. And the reason they did this is he wanted to grant a favor to the Jews. And as we pick it up in chapter 25, we see that Felix was replaced. He was not a very good ruler, and so the Roman Empire, they replaced him with a man named Festus. And it says this in verse 1. 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. They requested that Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, "Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there." And so Paul, he appears before Festus, and Festus asks Paul, "Hey, are you willing to go to Jerusalem for this trial?" And Paul responds in this way. And remember, Paul was not only a Jewish person, he was also a Roman citizen. And so he doesn't think he's going to get a fair trial if he goes to Jerusalem. Also, he thinks he may even be killed as he goes there. And so as a Roman citizen, it was his right to appeal to Caesar in hopes of getting this fair trial, and that is what he does. And also, just to put this in a little context, the Caesar that was ruling at this time is a man named Nero. Nero reigned from AD 54 to 68, and his nickname was the Beast. And the reason his nickname was the Beast is because he was very brutal, and he actually hated Christians. A fire started at one point during his reign, and he blamed this on the Christians. And so he was just a very brutal ruler. But for the first 5 years of his reign, he actually ruled with justice. He was a good ruler for those first 5 years. And this is the time period that we find ourselves in here with Paul. And as we get to verse 13, we see that this other man, King Agrippa, shows up with Bernice. Now, Bernice is Agrippa's sister, and they were actually in this incestuous relationship. And this is the reason that Luke does not call Bernice the wife of Agrippa. And so Festus, he consults with Agrippa about Paul, because if Festus is going to send him to Caesar to be tried, he needs to have a good and solid explanation of why he's doing this, of why he's taking up the time of the Caesar. And so that's why he meets with Agrippa. And let's pick it up in verse 23. It says this in verse 23, "The next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in." And so in verse 24, Festus, he kicks off the meeting about why they're there. He invites Paul in to speak. And basically chapter 26 is Paul giving this masterful testimony of his conversion. And so Paul, in this testimony, he's not only claiming his innocence, he's not only defending himself, but he also takes this opportunity to share the gospel. And I want to recall to your attention what the Lord told Ananias at Paul's conversion after the Damascus Road experience. It says this in Acts chapter 9, verse 15. The Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man, Paul, is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles, their kings, and the people of Israel." And so this is exactly what is taking place. Paul, he wouldn't have, wanted to go through all these trials, but the Lord was using this situation to have Paul speak to all these different audiences, governors, kings, to the Jewish leaders, all these audiences that he probably would not have had the opportunity to do so. And so again, we see the Lord providentially working in this situation. Well, as Paul is giving his defense and his testimony, he shares the gospel. And when he gets to the resurrection, Festus interrupts him, and it says this in verse 24. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense, and he said, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane." Which, just by the way, may be a response that you get when you talk to your family and friends about the gospel and about Jesus rising from the dead. They may think you are kind of out of your mind as well. And Paul says this in verse 25, "I am not insane, most excellent Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable." And then in verse 26, "The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner." And then I love what Paul says to Agrippa in verse 27. He puts Agrippa on the spot. He says, "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" And Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains." And so, what a great appeal that Paul makes to the king and all those there in the audience. And then it says this in verse 30, "The king arose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. After they left the room, they began saying to one another, 'This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment.'" And so even though Paul was innocent, because he did not think he was going to get a fair trial, because he thought if he went back to Jerusalem he may be killed, he had appealed to Caesar. And because of this, they cannot make any final determination, but they do as Paul requested, and they send him off to Rome to eventually have a trial with Nero. So, and that's what we're going to look at in our next study as we look at Acts chapters 27 and 28. But before we end, let's look at the following questions. Number one is this: when was the last time you thanked God for saving you? You know, you may not have this dramatic experience like Paul. Most of us won't. I mean, some people that we know living in this life of sin and all these things, maybe it's drugs or alcohol, and the Lord dramatically transforms their life. And so that may be you, but most of us, it's a little calmer than what we saw with Paul, who was off to persecute Christians, and then he himself became saved. But do you thank the Lord for your salvation? I would encourage you to do this so often. Think about your sins and the failures that you have. That's not always pleasant, but at the same time, the Lord's grace will become present to you as you think about your failures in your life and your sin. And so again, I want you to thank Him for that. And number two is this: if you had 2 minutes to explain to someone how your life has been transformed by grace, what would you say? Your testimony is a powerful way for you to share the gospel. Everybody loves a good story, and so I would encourage you, as you think through your testimony, be real, be honest. Again, some of you may come from a background that's a very dramatic change. Others of us maybe grew up in church, and we think maybe it's not a cool of a story, but that's an amazing story of faithfulness that maybe your parents or your grandparents had. And so everybody connects with different things as you share your testimony. And so again, I would encourage you to take some time to think about that. And then as you kind of wrap it up into a 2-minute presentation, if you will, I would encourage you to think through some family and friends that you could share that with. Well, I hope you enjoyed this study. We'll see you next time as we finish up the book of Acts.